Jim Fullmer of Demeter Biodynamic will conclude our speaker panel for tonight. Next up, I'd like to invite Jim Fullmer from Demeter Biodynamic. Big warm welcome to Jim, who also made quite a drive to be here tonight.
Actually, it wasn't that far of a drive. I'm from near Corvallis as well. So I'm curious how many of you are growers? Yeah, good. Okay. What I'm here to talk to you about, pretty condensed slides here. This is meant to be an hour and a half, and so I'm going to have to blow through some of it. And it's pretty comprehensive what I need to cover, but I'm going to talk about biodynamic agriculture. How many of you are familiar with what that is? Yeah, only in Eugene, right? So that's good. I'm a biodynamic farmer out in Kings Valley that's about, as a bird flies, an hour towards the coast, kind of. And it wasn't long ago, I worked for an organization called Demeter. Demeter is actually very old. It's been around since 1927. It was really the first codification of sustainable agriculture, and it's been going ever since then. It's international. Yeah. It's international. There's Demeter organizations all over the world. We all get together every year somewhere in the world and create a standard and evolve this standard that started about 100 years ago. And so we use this as an education template, really, the standard. So I'm going to go through some of the principles of this standard, the Demeter standard, to explain biodynamic agriculture. I'm not going to get much into Demeter certification. I'll just say quickly for growers that it was a little less than a year ago that Demeter in the US decided to start certifying cannabis. I think it's good for the consumer. You're going to see as growers, it's not necessarily what you're all used to, because this is a very old agronomic farming standard, and we're in Oregon and Washington and California. We're moving into a brave new world where we're leaving garages and warehouses and grow lights and actually growing these plants outdoors. All right, good. All right, so that's what I want to talk about. Just a quick history. Do any of you know who Alan Chadwick was? Biodynamic movement in the United States is a very interesting thing. It's a European reality that landed here. It really didn't start taking. It's been here since the 30s, but it's been within the past 10, 15 years. This is really starting to happen. Alan Chadwick was at UC Santa Cruz in the early 70s, 71, 72. He developed this group of people around him. He was one of the instruments of biodynamic agriculture on the West Coast of the United States. Many of these people on this slide are still farming. I don't know how many of you know the Fry family, the Fry wines, but that's Jonathan and Katrina on the left. They're still biodynamic farmers in California. Stephen and Gloria Decatur, who are also down in California, Live Power Farm. Okay, so here it is. The Demeter Farm Standard is broken into 7 principles, okay? And each one of these principles you could spend a day on. So I'm just going to go through them quickly, but here they are. And really, the base to this in the United States or anywhere in the world, the base to the Demeter standard is the organic standard in whatever country it is. So for us, it's the National Organic Program. Are you all familiar with that? USDA, you know, most of the labels you see here that are organic have the USDA seal on them. Assume that's the base of this. I'm not going to get into that. And what I'm talking about are things that are beyond that, you know, out of the scope of the NOP, but it has it as a base. NOP means National Organic Program. We also do organic certification. So these slides are a little cattywampus, but principle number one on a biodynamic farm, and I want you to imagine growing cannabis this way, even if it's in a greenhouse, is biological diversity. And that can be above ground, that can be below ground. We've had a number of talks about the below ground, but also above ground. The Demeter Farm Standard requires that 10% of a farm is set aside for this. So there's a couple examples. You'll either have wild areas, which in Oregon we're still blessed with them, or if they don't exist, a classic example would be a vineyard in Sonoma County, California, or Napa County, California, where it's wall-to-wall grapes. They have to plant this 10%. But having botanical diversity, so not only cannabis, but other crops. If you can imagine cannabis being in a crop rotation, like corn. I mean, hemp, you can understand it with hemp. This would be with cannabis. So it's not, and I've been around the cannabis culture all my adult life, I understand it. It's not what we're all necessarily used to yet. And then genetic diversity, also very important. I'll get into that. Just a quick example of how we look at the biodiversity botanically on a farm. This is my own farm up in Kings Valley. A lot of our biodiversity is found in a riparian of a river. Fence rows, irrigation main lines, if they're just left alone, create great corridors. There's a real marriage between biodynamic and permaculture happening right now. Those of you that have worked with permaculture, those permaculture principles apply very well to this and vice versa. So anyhow, 10%, having botanical diversity, having diversity above ground, below ground, one of the principles of this standard, one of the principles of biodynamic agriculture. Another one that's core is generating your own fertility. Again, for cannabis growers, this is challenging. So, the guanos and the fossilized bird shit from Chile and all doesn't apply. I mean, you can bring in a certain amount of nitrogen, a certain amount of phosphorus, but the idea is to generate it out of the life of the system. It's a different approach. So basic to biodynamic fertility, one element is composting, biodynamic composting. I'll get into the biodynamic preparations in a minute. But there's a very specific way of building compost. The goal is to recycle your carbon. I think you mentioned taking your leaves. That's carbon. That would be recycling it. Reducing tillage. It's another interesting concept to figure out with cannabis. Why reduce tillage? A lot of it gets back to this discussion about sequestering carbon, and the base of a biodynamic fertility system is building humus, building carbon in the soil. Every time you till, depending on your soil type, you burn it up. So the idea is to reduce tillage. This isn't working well. Integrating livestock. This is where it gets really interesting. I mean, foundational to a biodynamic farming system is integrating animals into it. Cows, sheep, chickens, turkeys. They serve in a lot of ways. I think I have a couple slides that follow, but not only do they bring sod into a crop rotation, that's where you build your soil, but they also produce manure and urine that you can compost and that they leave on the ground, and you're closing fertility loops with animals. There's energetic elements to the cow in particular, very important to biodynamic as well. Use of green manures. I've been around a lot of organic farmers. I'm always amazed how Some aren't using the legumes, for instance. That's free nitrogen pulled out of the air by the plant, incorporated back into the earth. Be very useful for cannabis. The biodynamic preparations, they're one of the principles themselves. I'll get into them. You can spend a lifetime on that discussion. And crop rotation. So I don't know, what's the standard crop rotation for cannabis? Like, we know what it is for corn, soybeans, but probably a legume. I mean, these are things that aren't fully figured out by many. I'm sure there's some of you out here that are doing this and have figured this out, but it's relatively new to this industry. And there it is. The principle is growing soil in the various methods that I pointed out. This term humus is very interesting. It's literally a colloid, a soil colloid, that is the ultimate result of raw organic carbon returning back to the earth. It's an inherent earthly process, humus. It's the base of a biodynamic farming system. I'd argue it's the base of an organic farming system. And I'll remind you that the biodynamic folks started 100 years ago. The organic standard went into effect in 1999, 2000. Waterway conservation, it's one of the principles in the standard. It matters with outdoor cannabis production. The fertilizers that are used, the techniques of tillage that are used can end up in the local waterways. So this particular standard pays attention to protecting fish-bearing waterways, and it pays attention to building the soil. You're going to see that these principles overlap because we're talking about a living system. In life, there's interconnectedness, so everything is overlapping in this. So when you are doing a biodynamic fertility system and building the soil, you're also increasing the soil's ability to hold water. It's off the charts. I don't know if those of you that have taken soil courses, but humus is the queen. It holds 100% of a saturated atmosphere, and it'll hold on to it until the plant needs it. So as we move into this insane summer of 2016, it's going to be hot. It's going to be crazy hot. It's going to be dry. You're going to start realizing the value of some of these just ancient agronomic practices in cannabis production. Generating your insect and disease control. This has been talked about a lot tonight. Out of the life of the system. So when you're importing your critters from Northwest, from the gentleman that just spoke, the idea is to have a habitat where they stay. They hunker down and stay. They don't leave. Below the ground and above the ground. So I don't dare should say this, but you shouldn't have to always be buying them in. They should move in and live there. So, and what is that, how do you do that? Well, you have their habitat, and that's connected to the botanical diversity, and as well as the crop rotation. This is all providing habitat for your beneficial insects. If you go under the ground for your beneficial microbes, it's like tide pools at the coast. You know, if you've ever gone, say, to Newport or Florence, and you go to the tide pools and you look at those rocks, there isn't an inch of space available. Why? And it's not just one organism. If you start looking close, it's thousands, totally covering it. No space in the end, so no pathogen can get out of control. Balanced living nutrition is directly related to disease and insect control. Why? Because in a system, say you have a cannabis plant and it's actually got a root system, and say it's not bound into a pot, it can actually go down. It's kind of like a grapevine. You know, there's probably a terroir to weed. You guys know this. And the better terroir, the better sense of place is going to come from the plants that have deep roots and living soils. And out of that interaction between the plant and living soils, it's a continuum. There's no separation. So as a healthy plant growing in a healthy soil needs nutrition, it happens out of the interplay between the plant and the life in the soil, not by taking some stuff and applying it to the plant. So it's a different approach to fertility. It's based on life in the soil, feeding that life. Your nitrogen, for instance, coming from legumes, coming from animal manures on the farm, etc. The stoned bumblebee. So you should see bumblebees in your cannabis patch. And not only bumblebees, but there's hundreds of species of bees. You should see them flying around in there. And if they're not there, ask why aren't they there? And usually it's a habitat thing, or we're using materials that are actually killing them. Even organically approved materials that are killing them. I don't even know what that slide's about. A nice healthy plant. This is from the Xerces Society up in Portland. Are you all familiar with them at all? Great resource. They've been around for a long time too, since the 30s. Originally formed to save this butterfly. They work a lot with pollinators, and not too long ago they took a look at materials being used in organics, pretty commonly allowed in a national list. You'll see it in the OMRI list, materials based on these things as it relates to pollinators. So the bees and other pollinators, and you can see some of them, I was floored because some of them that I used to use and feel pretty safe with actually are pretty toxic to beneficial organisms above and below ground. The one that really got me was spinosad, because I remember when that first came out, it was beautiful. It's like it doesn't kill ladybugs, it doesn't kill lacewings. You know, what it kills though is the bee species. And if you really look at bees and pollinators, there's hundreds, thousands of them, and it kills them. So all your good wasps, you know, your bumblebees, your honey, not just the honeybee. The honeybee was imported here. I mean, the native bees. So we pay a lot more attention to materials being used. I know I'm myself just learning how to grow cannabis. I don't know how to grow it. I know it's hard. Can be hard in given years. You have mites, I know that. You have fungal issues. And this would get you being careful about the materials you're using, even if they're allowed in organic. It is. This whole presentation's on our website. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. So how many of you ever used the biodynamic preparations? This is awesome. Good. I can't do them justice in 2 minutes or 5 minutes, so I'll just try to explain them quickly. The biodynamic preparations go back to Rudolf Steiner. I mean, it was about this time of year, 1924, in Europe. A bunch of concerned farmers, these were actually counts and countesses, went to Steiner, who at the time was pretty he was respected. He had world leaders going to him trying to figure out the aftermath of the war economically. He came up with this whole idea of associative economics, Waldorf education, all this crazy stuff. But this week in June, he got a room like this full of hundreds of people and just laid down these pretty esoteric concepts. He laid down the principles of the biodynamic preparations. They're foundational to biodynamic agriculture. The best way to explain them, as a farmer, and this is how I understand them, is as they're homeopathic medications for the earth. And as your naturopath would treat you or I as a living organism with wider connections and rhythm, these are treating the earth that way. As a living organism, James Lovelock, 1972, the Gaia theory still has not been disproven. Living organism, 2 field sprays, okay? So you see these principles in a lot of philosophical thought, a lot of religions. They all have this basic idea that there's 2 poles. There's a light pole and there's a dark pole. Color is based on this. Goethe based the theory of color on the fact that there's light and darkness and there's an interplay between the 2. That's what color is. In a farming system, you're dealing with celestial, cosmic elements, and you're dealing with terra firma, Mother Earth, material reality, and it's about the interplay between the 2. The biodynamic preparations address that reality in a wider sphere. Their use is like medicine for the earth, essentially. So you can imagine growing cannabis with these things. I mean, you have consumers using what you're growing to save their lives. This is medicine. This is herbal medicine. And they want, if you were sick and you needed whatever herb to heal you, you want it to be grown holistically. These play a big role in the quality of that finished product. The flower. Oops, going the wrong way. Integration of livestock. So like I said, we got into this pretty recently, and as you can imagine, that's a lot of phone conversations with growers. And the question is, how do you integrate livestock into a cannabis growing operation? Are any of you integrating livestock into a cannabis operation? A little bit? So, you can. Here's the contribution of livestock to an agronomic system, cannabis, sweet corn, whatever. One is biological fertility. They're the foundation of building humus on the earth. Biomimicry, we'll talk about that in a minute because this is what this is based on. Livestock are used a lot for weed control. These are pigs on a biodynamic apricot farm in Michigan. They're tilling in the row, but at the same time, they're also fertilizing. Pest control, chickens, descendants of dinosaurs. You can imagine if you were an ant, what one of them would look like. Ferocious. And they're not vegetarians, by the way. Not vegetarians. I've seen them eat snakes and mice. So pest control, significant. Water conservation, related to that. So you're building soil humus based on the integration of livestock. You're going to hold soil moisture. That's the general idea. It's been within one generation. One generation, Less than 100 years, pretty much every American farmstead had animals on it. And within a period of 1 or 2 generations, the animals all got plucked out of the homesteads and put into CAFOs that are creating huge issues. The idea is to let them live a noble life and not have the issues of that. So, biomimicry was mentioned earlier. I like to use this slide as a great example of the value of the ruminant. And I use the native northern plains of North America, great example. Some of the best soils in the world. This is how they were built. Most fertile soils in the world. The way they were built was based on the interrelation between grasslands and ruminants, which for us was bison, and humus. How many of you are familiar with Alan Savory? No? So Alan Savory was a guy in Africa who watched what was happening on the savannah. And he actually figured out how to return desert to green. And what he observed was that the lions would, and there'd be a herd of wildebeest. What the lions do is they herd the wildebeest. And so the weaker ones on the outside get picked off by the lions. Because the lions are there, the wildebeests are always kind of compact, they're always nervous, and they're always moving really fast. It's where the principle of mob grazing came from, except humans are moving the animals instead of predators. So for us in North America, it was the wolves. And the wolves would herd the ruminants, and the bison, they'd be picking off the weak ones on the outside, and the strong ones would survive, but they kept them moving. And what happens when you have a herd of bison that's clumped up together and moving all the time is they're tromping down the soil, and they're pooping and peeing on it, and that's how those soils were built. Nothing more, nothing less. So what we're trying to do in a biodynamic system is mimic that, not only in the poop and the pee, but the crop rotation, having sod in there, basically, grazing. It's ancient foundation of agronomy. Not new stuff, not specific to biodynamic either. There's a section on gentle post-harvest handling. I don't have a lot of slides on it. There's a whole Demeter processing standard. And this is a whole nother interesting reality. I mean, when you're talking about oils and extracts, what happens to the cannabis after it's harvested? And there's carbon dioxide, there's also some nasty solvents, etc. The Demeter Farm Standard, for instance, for all types of food, there's like 19 different standards, right? There's one for dairy, for personal care products, for wine, etc., etc., etc. Oils, nut butters. It's all about leaving the agricultural ingredient alone and not manipulating it, letting it bring through its properties. So it's an interesting unanswered question with cannabis. And I'm going to stop there because now I'm getting into a California presentation I gave. So I know that was fast. But any basic questions about how biodynamic farming would relate to cannabis production or otherwise?
Looking for hands.
Is there a way to encourage the fairies and the elves?
Say it again.
The question was, is there a way to encourage the fairies and the elves in the garden?
Yeah. So, absolutely. So Steiner called them the elementals, right? It was more Germanic and Celtic, kind of blended with Ayurvedic, really interesting. The biodynamic preparations, absolutely. And I think, you know, the thing about it is, and the way he started the whole description of biodynamic agriculture was this idea of a farm as a living organism in its own right. And then that led to the fact that a farm is an individuality, just like you and I. And so each one's different. And so the answer to your question is between you and your land and tuning into them, right? Yeah, and make them welcome, absolutely. And you can scare them away. But, you know, it's hard to give recipes for fairies and elementals. They do exist.
We have another question down here, Jim.
Where are you?
Yes, I wanted to
Oh, you're over there, okay.
I wanted to refer you to a book called Hemp Husbandry. Hemp Husbandry, that covers the growing practices of hemp of our founding fathers, including the anonymous hemp farmer of Annapolis. And another thing, are you familiar with Dr. Herbert Koch, who wrote Biodynamic Agriculture in 1976, the results of 10 years of BD farming research, in which he says that hemp is the companion plant of potato. It prevents potato blight because of the exudation of the soil, things that come from the hemp plant that protects the potato. And the United Nations has said that the potato is the #1 crop in the world for feeding people, for a crop that's easily grown and most liked. This alone should justify the worldwide legalization of the cannabis family.
Yeah, so Herbert, I didn't know Herbert brought up the hemp plant, which is interesting because some of Demeter US is getting some friction from Europe about this, actually. But Herbert was in Oregon, and he actually, he was there's a group of people that make the biodynamic preparations in Oregon, in Notai, at Wintergreen Farm. You know, so those of you have a local biodynamic farm that makes the preparations earnestly, that's where you're going to learn them best. But anyhow, Herbert was right there at the beginning of the formation of that, right then, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's great. You mentioned legumes for nitrogen fixation, and that's a good way to get nitrogen. I think potassium is fairly easy to come up with as well. But do you have any good solutions for managing the phosphorus on site and recycling it, keeping it mobile, keeping it available?
Yeah. Phosphorus is an interesting one because nitrogen we can pull out of the air. Nitrogen we can get out of manures. We can get some phosphorus out of manures, but the one challenge with phosphorus is its availability, right? It could be there and be locked up with either aluminum or, so many things that just want to hold it so it's not available. Those of you that are more scientific might be able to answer this better, but the studies I've read is when you have large biological diversity in your soil, it buffers. So high pHs go down, low pHs go up, and phosphorus is more soluble and available. And then the question is, how do you cycle that? And on my own farm, one way we do it is with red clover. We grow it as a crop, harvest the blossom and dry it for medicinals. And what I've noticed with the red clover and the phosphorus levels is that it's got a taproot and it goes down pretty far. And when it incorporates and it uses a lot of phosphorus, so when it incorporates it into itself, a large portion stays, it brings it up into the topsoil. So legumes, definitely.
A follow-up question to that, I've heard of doing similar things with buckwheat. Have you experimented with that for its phosphorus accumulating abilities at all?
I've heard that buckwheat for whatever reason, is good at moving. You know, again, with phosphorus, it's usually, question one is it there or not there? In Oregon, it's usually there, and in pretty good quantity in most of our soils, but it's tied up because the pHs are so low, you know? And so, again, I don't know what it is the buckwheat does, but it's some kind of buffering of soil life and pHs and that sort of thing that makes it more available.
Jim, how do you feel about fruit and flower ferments for high phosphorus and reincorporating that in the garden?
I think there's something to that, definitely. If it's a fruit or a flower that's high in phosphorus, absolutely, yeah.
Like you said, it's just about availability. Yeah.
It's availability, and at the end of the day, not digging big holes in the ground and putting stuff in trucks and driving them around, yeah. Or rail cars.
Other questions for Jim? Oh.
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I try and incorporate our chickens onto our farm, and I don't have a capacity for a lot of livestock because it's just kind of me and a couple other people. I do have a neighbor a mile away that has an organic practice where I get manure and we try and incorporate into our compost, where it's not the living organism of a biodynamic farm. Would Demeter consider that, you know, an ecosystem since it was so close to our farm?
You're gonna, yeah, I mean, Demeter doesn't say you can't import anything, because though there are some farms we work with that have been doing it for so long, they're almost there. I mean, it's pretty impressive. Takes a long time. But, so it'll fall back on the organic national list, right? And then there's a bunch of stuff on it that Demeter wouldn't allow, but you can import 36 pounds of nitrogen per acre, for instance, from the OMRI list, say, as long as it's not Chilean nitrate or CAFO manures and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Any final questions? All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much again.
Thanks
and
for having
big
me.
round of applause. Thank you, Jim. And if y'all would bear with me for just a few more slides. All right. I wanted to give a second shout out to tonight's sponsors. Again, there's no way we could keep this event free to the public if it weren't for the generous monthly sponsorship this month by the Herbal Connection and by Head Stash Horticulture. Thank you again so much for making this happen for us. So I just wanted to remind you all that this is meant to be dynamic and this is meant to be for you. So please reach out to us with questions, ideas. If you want to sponsor a Cannabis Science Pub, if you have a great idea for a topic this year, please give Bethany and I a shout out. I'll be leaving this slide up at the very end of the night. And I also want to let everybody know, in case you weren't aware, video footage of the Cannabis Science Pub events is available online through healthorganics.com. Compliments of Stardog Botanicals. We appreciate you capturing these historical events so very much. Thank you for your time and energy. Eat Science Pub. Again, just a reminder to fill out a survey form before you go. We really want to hear from all of you. And again, the only way we can keep this event going and keep you all engaged is to hear what you want from us. So please reach out with ideas. Take that second, shoot me or Bethany an email, or fill out one of those evaluation forms before you go. And please join us next month, June 28th. We'll be covering pests and pathology, which is quite the rabbit hole and very relevant to our outdoor season that's upon us. So we really appreciate the big turnout tonight. Thank you all for coming after a very long Memorial Day weekend. And please join us again next month for Cannabis Science Pub. Thank you all so much. And now, let's eat pizza, drink beer, and mingle for our networking portion tonight. Thank you all.